The harsh sun bore down on the desert colony of Lantin, its twin moons casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Walter Kempton shielded his eyes as he stepped out of his modest dwelling, the dry air stinging his nostrils. Even after 15 years on this desolate planet, he had never quite grown accustomed to the unforgiving climate. Lantin was the first human colony established on SP-347, a distant world orbiting a red dwarf star. The initial surveys had promised rich mineral deposits and a breathable atmosphere, making it an ideal candidate for extraterrestrial settlement. But the reality of life on Lantin proved far harsher than anyone could have anticipated. The settlers' dreams of lush forests and flowing rivers quickly withered in the face of Lantin's desert wastelands. Scorching temperatures, toxic dust storms, and a lack of surface water made survival a constant struggle. Only the most resilient and determined colonists remained after those first few grueling years. Walter was among that stalwart few, having volunteered for the expedition with a sense of pioneering spirit and wide-eyed optimism. Now, 15 years later, the lines etched into his weathered face told a story of hard-won perseverance. As the colony's senior geologist, Walter had played a pivotal role in locating and extracting the precious resources that sustained their outpost. His expertise had quite literally kept them alive, allowing the colonists to eke out an existence on this inhospitable world. Despite the challenges, a sense of community had blossomed among the settlers. The shared struggle to carve out a life on Lantin forged unbreakable bonds, a kinship that transcended bloodlines. It was this unity that had carried them through the darkest days, when starvation and despair threatened to consume them all. Today, Walter's routine was much like any other day. He secured his protective mask and set off across the dusty terrain, his boots leaving imprints in the rust-colored sand. The colony's central market was his destination, a bustling hub where the settlers traded goods and shared news. As he approached the market, Walter couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. What had once been a ramshackle collection of prefabricated shelters now resembled a small, thriving town. The colonists had adapted, terraforming the land and erecting sturdier structures to withstand the planet's harsh conditions. The market itself was a chaotic tapestry of sights, sounds, and scents. Vendors hawked their wares, calling out to potential customers in a myriad of languages. The aroma of exotic spices mingled with the pungent tang of alien fruits and the acrid smell of machine oil. Walter made his way through the crowded stalls, exchanging friendly nods and greetings with his fellow colonists. His keen eye scanned the offerings, searching for the freshest provisions to bring back to his wife and children. As a founding member of the colony, Walter took immense pride in their hard-won existence on Lantin. Each day was a testament to human resilience, a defiant stand against the unforgiving cosmos. And yet, despite all they had endured, the greatest challenge still lay ahead, a threat none of them could have foreseen, a nightmare that would test the very limits of their survival. Little did Walter know, as he haggled with a vendor over the price of some alien tubers, that their world was about to be turned upside down. The peaceful routine he had come to rely upon was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Walter had just secured a bounty of fresh provisions when the first screams pierced the din of the market. At first, he dismissed them as merely part of the constant clamor that pervaded the colony's center of commerce. But then more screams rang out, shrill and laced with sheer terror. Abandoning his purchases, Walter fixated on the source of the commotion near the outskirts of the colony. People were fleeing, expressions of abject horror contorting their features. His blood ran cold as a towering plume of dust and debris erupted from the ground, blotting out the blazing sunlight. Walter broke into a sprint, his boots kicking up ruddy clouds with every step. As he approached the edge of the colony, a nightmarish scene unfolded before his eyes. Gargantuan creatures, their chitinous hides glistening like obsidian, erupted from the depths of the desert. Each grotesque monstrosity easily dwarfed the colony's largest ground transports, their massive bodies undulating with sickening, alien motions. Multitudes of jagged appendages tore through the earth, flailing wildly as if to anchor the behemoths in place. But the subterranean beasts were not alone. In their towering wake, dense clouds of winged terrors took to the air, blotting out Lantin's crimson sky like a noxious fog. Their shrill, deafening screeches sliced through Walter's mind, chilling him to his core. He had never witnessed anything like this, not in all his years on the unforgiving deserts of Lantin. The largest of the towering horrors unfurled a nightmarish maw, a cavern of serrated fangs glistening with corrosive drool. Its shriek tore through the colony, a bone-rattling roar that shattered windows and sent tremors through the very earth. That primordial bellow was the harbinger of utter chaos. The winged swarms descended upon the colony like a voracious plague, their razor-edged wings shredding anything in their path. Colonists scattered in blind panic, many falling prey to the ravenous creatures that engulfed them with snapping mandibles and whip-like appendages. Walter stood paralyzed for a single, endless moment, his mind unable to process the horror unfolding around him. This was not the dire scenario they had trained for, not the exercise simulations they had endured time and again. This was an apocalyptic nightmare, an impossible cataclysm beyond their worst fears. Then, like a switch being flipped, his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Ripping his sidearm from its holster, Walter opened fire at the nearest of the gargantuan creatures. His plasma rounds detonated against its armored hide, charring the obsidian carapace, but failing to penetrate. The towering beast turned its multitudinous eyes towards him, sensing the insignificant threat he posed. In that moment, Walter knew only one truth: fight or be consumed. With grim resolution, he pressed the attack, moving perpendicular to avoid the creature's snapping appendages. His ears rang with the deafening sounds of shrieks and shattered structures. All around him, the colony was being devoured. The colony descended into pandemonium as the monstrosities laid waste to everything in their path. Towering alien bugs smashed through prefabricated structures as easily as a human might crush an insect underfoot. The shrill whine of the winged swarms filled the air, deafening and unrelenting. Walter fought with grim determination, his plasma pistol barking in defiance. But his efforts seemed pitifully inadequate against the onslaught of nightmarish bioforms. For every one he managed to repel, a dozen more surged forward, undeterred. He took cover behind an overturned ground transport, its hull riddled with rents and gouges from the creature's flailing appendages. All around him, the colony was disintegrating into a war zone of flame, shrapnel, and caustic ichor. A woman's anguished scream tore through the cacophony. Walter risked a glance over the twisted metal of his refuge to see a knot of survivors hemmed in by a massive bug. Its serrated mandibles worked in obscene hunger as it encircled its prey like a grotesque python. Without a second thought, Walter broke from cover and charged towards the creature, his plasma fire detonating against its armored flank. He roared through his rebreather mask, a feral battle cry fueled by sheer adrenaline. The behemoth turned its maleficent regard towards Walter, a dozen quivering sensory appendages zoning in on the insignificant irritant. Then, with blinding swiftness, it struck a bladed limb lancing towards him like a scorpion's sting. Walter threw himself aside at the last possible instant. The bugs' strike slammed into the ground beside him in a spray of shattered ferrocrete. He felt the rush of unstoppable force and the concussive impact, like a terrific storm rolling over him. But the creature paid for its single-minded focus. The knot of survivors seized the momentary opening, scattering and fleeing for what little shelter remained. Walter saw their terrified faces a mix of colony personnel and off-world contractors. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met his, wide with soul-rending fear and naked gratitude. Then the winged swarm swept over them, and their screams were drowned out in a torrent of rending flesh and obscene feasting. On his knees, Walter felt bile rising in his throat. He had witnessed death more times than he could count in his years on the unforgiving frontier of Lantin, but nothing could have prepared him for this unfathomable onslaught. Yet he could not falter, could not surrender to despair. His world was dying around him, yet his family remained alive somewhere amid the chaos. The thought lent him newfound determination, a sweeping sense of purpose that drowned out the screams and shrieks assaulting his senses. The behemoth turned back towards Walter, undulating with malign hunger. This time he held his ground, waiting until the last possible instant before rolling aside from its skewering strike. His plasma fire gouged through its carapace, searing away layers of armored plating to reveal the pulsating biomass beneath. An acrid stench, like burning hair and offal, filled his rebreather. The creature recoiled, shuddering and spraying corrosive ichor that sizzled against the ferrocrete. It raised itself on its multitude of armored limbs, preparing to bear down on Walter with the full brunt of its terrible mass. But that was when the screaming whine of aerospace rails split the air. The colony's defense forces had finally arrived, streaking in from the fortified outpost on vectored thruster plumes. Ranks of powered armor infantry deployed, raking the alien bug behemoths with concentrated weapons fire. Walter saw their armored silhouettes incoming, emblazoned with the tri-bar insignia of the United Colonial Protectorate. Hope flared in his battered soul as he recognized the distinctive configurations of their heavy ordnance pyro lances and cyclonic incendiary launchers. The soldiers swept into the colony on jets of superheated plasma, their munitions detonating against the nightmarish bugs and cyclonic blossoms of cleansing flame. Torrents of liquid promathium washed over the rampaging beasts, adhering to their chitinous hides and consuming them in pyrocaustic infernos. All around Walter, the soldiers of the UCP fought with lethal proficiency, a bulwark between the surviving colonists and the ravening swarms. He saw the winged bugs immolated in searing plasma fire, their desiccated husks raining from the blood-tinged sky, like macabre meteors. Yet for every creature they cut down, for every one they burned from Lantin's surface, more seemed to boil forth from the shattered terrain. The soldiers were rapidly becoming overwhelmed by the sheer, endless tide of monstrosities. Walter fought beside them, his pistol barking in defiance, until its power cell was finally drained. He discarded it, scooping up the pyro lance of a fallen UCP soldier. Its triggering stud activated with a flick of his thumb, spraying out a fan of searing promathium that washed over a cluster of bugs in a tidal wave of fire. Everywhere Walter turned, the colony wore a mantle of flame and shredded metal. Bodies lay strewn amidst the rubble, an awful human and bug alike. The once thriving market square had become an abattoir, a site of unfathomable massacre. He saw the crumpled forms of people he'd known for over a decade, friends and colleagues now reduced to shredded remains amidst the nightmare descending on Lantin. Everywhere, the acrid stench of seared flesh and cauterized wounds burned his nostrils past his rebreather filters. Yet still Walter fought on, driven by the primal need to endure, to reach his family's dwelling before the ravenous horrors scoured all life from the colony. He locked eyes with the UCP soldier beside him, a woman whose faceplate had shattered inward from some unspeakable impact. Her expression was one of haggard determination. She gave a curt nod, then surged ahead in a pounding run towards the next rank of bugs bearing down on them. Walter followed, his pyro lance spraying arcs of liquid fire and searing contrails. He tried not to look as the soldier's form was swallowed up by the vortex of snapping appendages and goring mouthparts. He was alone again, stumbling half-blinded through the inferno that had once been his home. The sounds of battle raged all around him, punctuated by the bone-rattling shrieks and concussive impacts. Then, through the charred haze and roiling smoke, he saw his family's dwelling, the one sure refuge he desperately sought. He broke into a sprint, his battered body screaming in protest. Only meters from sanctuary, a bug materialized through the conflagration like a manifestation of hell itself. The bug towered over Walter, its grotesque bulk blotting out the roiling smoke and flames surrounding them. Waves of undulating mutability rippled across its glistening carapace as it reconfigured its myriad appendages into an array of slashing, stabbing, and rending extremities. Walter backpedaled, his pyro lance discharging and searing waves of liquid promathium that washed over the creature's hide. Acrid smoke billowed up in foul plumes, yet the behemoth remained unfazed, advancing with dreadful, inexorable purpose. In a whirling blur, it struck a bladed limb scything through the air, aimed directly for Walter's head. He threw himself aside at the last instant, feeling the breach of compression as the risered point carved through the space where his skull had been. He hit the ground hard, the pyro lance clattering from his grasp amid a cascade of blazing promathium globules. Walter rolled, trying desperately to regain his feet as the alien bug bore down on him. Suddenly, a dazzling beam of coherent plasma seared through the creature's flank, searing away layers of armored biomass in an eruption of cauterized ichor. The behemoth recoiled, spraying forth noxious clouds of vapor. The UCP soldiers thundered in, forming a reinforced perimeter around Walter. Their ranks bristled with plasma lances and heavy repeating rail cannons that raked the bug with coruscating fire. Yet it refused to fall, undulating and reconfiguring its anatomy in a dizzying display of metamorphic horror. Bladed appendages and lashing tendrils whipped out in all directions, forcing the soldiers to augment their firing lines with kinetic shield projectors. Through the haze of battle, Walter glimpsed a welcome sight, the bulk of a UCP Leonidas heavy assault walker cresting a rise, its twin heavy plasma cannons swiveling to bear on the bug. The mecha's resonance shielding flared brilliantly as it waded into the melee, seemingly unperturbed by the raking strikes of the creature's mutating extremities. "Get back," a voice crackled over Walter's helmet comm. He obeyed instinctively, scrambling away from the epicenter as the Leonidas's gunners achieved weapons lock. Wind lances of annihilation lashed forth, spearing through the bug in an apocalyptic discharge of energy. For a frozen instant, the creature's amorphous mass glowed incandescent, limned in ghostly plasma fire. Then its colossal form detonated in a cataclysmic shockwave that sent Walter tumbling amidst the rubble. He lay there, dazed and barely conscious, as the artificial night rained down shards of ceramite and xenomass alike. His ears rang with the thunderclap of that devastating salvo. Dimly, he perceived armored UCP soldiers moving amongst the aftermath, their weapons scanning for further threats. Then a woman's voice cut through the concussive fog enveloping him. "Walter. Walter Kempton, can you hear me?" He squinted past his shattered faceplate to see a UCP field operative kneeling beside him. Even through his battered helm, he recognized her Major Eliza Vance, commander of the colony's defense forces. Major Walter wheezed, his words emerging in a pained rasp. "My family." Vance gripped his hand, her helmet mirroring his battered state after the hellish battle. "We've secured their dwelling. Your wife and children are safe." Walter sagged back, his body finally surrendering to the enormity of what he had endured. Tears stung his eyes as a wave of pure, soul-cleansing relief washed over him. How he rasped, unable to fathom how any of them had survived the apocalyptic onslaught. "Your final stand bought them time," Kempton Vance replied, her voice thick with admiration. "You and every other colonist who refused to surrender. The colony's still standing because of you." Walter felt himself ebbing, the crescendo of adrenaline and terror crashing over him in pounding waves. His eyes drifted past Vance, over the burning hellscape that had once been his home on Lantin. The desert winds whipped through the rubble-strewn streets, carrying the acrid reek of battle. Yet in the distance, he saw flickers of life people emerging from shelters to gaze out across the cratered expanse. A child clutching its mother's hand. Soldiers offering an elderly man a nutrients pack and canteen of water. As darkness encroached on Walter's vision, those resilient embers shone ever brighter. Despite everything, despite the nightmare they had endured against an extinction-level event, the colony still lived. The people of Lantin still endured. It was a truth that filled Walter's battered spirit with a sense of wonder and unfathomable pride as he finally surrendered to the blissful oblivion of unconsciousness. I hope you enjoyed this story. Be sure to leave it a like on your way out. Check out one of our other videos too, and don't forget to subscribe.